Hi, I'm Lou Eisen. Welcome to Ring Talk. Today we have a fantastic show for you. We have a guest I've been waiting a long time, one of my heroes in the sport of boxing, Adam J. Pollock. The J stands for just brilliant, because that's absolutely what he is. He's a member of the Boxing Writers Association of America. He should be Boxing Writers Association of America. He's one of the top boxing referees and judges in the entire sport. He's a former coach, and he's an attorney living in Iowa City, Iowa. And I love attorneys. All my cousins and relatives are attorneys. Adam was a guest lecturer on the career of John L. Sullivan for the Whitehall Lecture Series at the Flagler Museum in Florida. Mr. Flagler, by the way, was part of Standard Oil 100 years before, and also an interviewee in the documentary film on James J. Corbett, the Gentleman Prize Fighter, which was narrated by Liam Neeson. And Adam's book on James J. Corbett is the best book ever written on James J. Corbett. In fact, Adam's book on every champion is the best book ever written on that champion. Adam has written and published In the Ring with John L. Sullivan, In the Ring with James J. Corbett, Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons' book brought me to tears, and I was really upset when it ended. I wasn't ready to let go. It was a friend. It was more than a book. And In the Ring with James J. Jeffries, In the Ring with Marvin Hart. No one knows anything about Marvin Hart, but when you read Adam's book, you'll know more than anyone else, except Adam, of course. In the Ring with Tommy Burns. And this is an interesting point. Canadians almost know nothing about Tommy Burns. And here's Adam, a genius writer and boxing historian who went to look up Tommy Burns. And this is an unbelievably brilliant book. And that's a cosmic understatement. In the Ring with Part 1, The Rise, and In the Ring with Jack Johnson Part 2, The Reign, Black Man versus the World. And I mean, this book it'll take your breath away. And his most recent book, which Thomas Hauser raved about. In fact, Thomas Hauser, who's written about Muhammad Ali, raves about all of Adam's work, is In the Ring with Jack Dempsey Part 1, The Making of a Champion. And it's available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, and Win by KO Publications on their website, which he owns. And he's published many other fantastic authors. And it's a thrill and a privilege. It's an extreme privilege to welcome to the show Adam J. Pollock. Adam, great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a very kind and over-generous introduction.
Well, thank you. I don't think so. For a person as brilliant as you, you're incredibly modest. And I find that in a lot of people that I've met that are incredibly brilliant. Dempsey, I never met Dempsey, of course, but I mean, people like yourself, you just have this streak of modesty, and I guess you just keep your head down and keep writing. What was it in you originally when you started writing about, we're going to get to the Dempsey book in a second, but when you started writing about Dempsey and all these champions, what was it inside you that made you do it? Was it you weren't satisfied with the information or the books that were out currently at that time?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it, as I felt like there was more out there to be had, and what had been done previously could be improved upon, and I set out to do it. And people seemed to like the books, and so I kept doing it.
Well, more than liking the books, I mean, people adored the books. I mean, your writing is similar to that of David McCullough and Michael Betzloss and Doris Kearns Goodwin. I mean, your works are definitive. Once you write about them, no one else can write about them because they can't do it as well as you can. With Dempsey, the question I've been waiting all week to ask you, Adam, is what is it about Dempsey that makes him such an enduring character? Even today, he hasn't held a title since 97 years ago. And yet he's still a global phenomenon. He's still known throughout the world. People still love the name. He's still Americana. He's still part of world history, sports history, American history. What makes him so enduring?
I guess you'd have to read the books to figure that one out. There was a lot of things that helped Dempsey. I mean, think of a young Mike Tyson, how that reinvigorated a lot of interest in boxing. If you harken back to the 80s when Mike Tyson came out, there's a huge boost of energy to the sport for many years as a result of him. And Dempsey was like Mike Tyson before Mike Tyson. He was this young, killer. Just came out to fight, blasted a lot of guys out really quickly, and just was ferocious. And he reinvigorated interest in the sport. And, he kind of coalesced at a time when boxing was getting bigger and bigger and getting more press coverage. The gates started getting bigger and bigger. He was the first $1 million payday, first $1 million gate, etc. So, he just captured the public's imagination.
Did when he came along, or I guess one of his biggest fights before he won the title was the 18-second demolition of Fred Fulton. Is there any film that exists prior to the Willard fight of Dempsey in the ring?
None that's been found. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist somewhere, but just nobody knows where it is. I'm pretty sure the Fulton fight was filmed. The question is what happened to the films. Obviously, they weren't very long.
Right.
I'm pretty sure some of the films were shown to the military, members of the military. Obviously, also what hurt back then was the nitrate films disintegrated very badly. They weren't preserved very well. Also, the Interstate Commerce Act that prevented the interstate transportation of fight films helped limit their proliferation. Although people tended to violate that law, and increasingly with impunity, as Dempsey's fights became more and more famous and generating more income. It was just too much money to turn down, so they started violating the law and transporting them anyway. And
yeah, I know with Jack Johnson, they that rule came in because of Johnson. But when I spoke to Steve Lott, whom you know, the late great Steve Lott, he said the Johnson Burns fight. He said there is. He saw the film where Burns is actually knocked to the canvas, but it was edited out. They got rid of it. They didn't want people to see it, and he said because of that, it was just very difficult. After that, as you're saying, to get films anywhere throughout the United States, although people were doing it. Would you say it's fair to say that Dempsey and Babe Ruth were the reason for the big money in the 1920s? Or was it Dempsey himself?
Well, Dempsey made Babe Ruth look like a pauper. The amount of money Dempsey made was phenomenal. It was just unheard of. Dempsey was making more in one fight than Babe Ruth made in several years of playing baseball. It's not even close. So, the 1920s was a boom in general, but I don't think you could put that many rear ends and seats, in any other sport at one time for the kind of prices that they were charging, and also generate the kind of revenue they were with the films, unless you're just a phenomenal star. And so, as big as Babe Ruth was, the truth is Dempsey was bigger. One thing I do want to allude to is the Johnson Burns fight films. That fight was filmed in its entirety, I do believe, and I think that the films were shown in their entirety initially. There are some claims that the film was edited. I guess that's possible, but I think more likely the films disintegrated over the years, or they played certain parts of the film so many times that they disintegrated. And so certain parts of the films just don't exist anymore.
Right.
I don't know that they, intentionally edited those parts out. I have some doubts about that.
Okay. I'm just repeating what Steve Lott was saying, but yeah, you could never. I would, if they, I'd love to see the complete film, but as you're saying, it's probably a lot of it because of it was done on nitrate, has disappeared. So hard to find a complete copy of the film. It's frustrating at times when you're watching it that you're only getting pieces of rounds rather than each round full.
Yeah, I mean that's the sad part. I mean, it's wonderful that we can still look at fights from 1908 and even partial rounds or selections. It still gives a flavor of the strengths and weaknesses of the various fighters. So it's wonderful, but unfortunately, they didn't preserve very well. And nitrate film was also very flammable as well. A lot of them burned.
Now, would you say Dempsey made the Times or the Times made Dempsey?
I mean, it's a little bit of both.
Right.
If he wasn't phenomenally talented, I don't think he would have been as big as he was. I think boxing was craving someone like him to some degree as well. But people. I mean, let's look at it this way. Like when he drilled Willard, and it was one of the most brutal things anyone had ever seen. And Willard was highly respected because he had beaten the great Jack Johnson. He was, Jack Johnson was 230 pounds, lightning fast, tremendous skills, pounded on Willard for 20 rounds, and Willard never went down. So Willard was seen as this, Iron Man, huge guy, 6'6", 235, 240 pounds, just a big dude. And Dempsey just went through him like nothing. So it just made people go, oh my God. And it got, garnered a lot of interest in his career.
Was the beating that Willard took, as boxing's premier historian, is that the worst beating you've ever seen a fighter take, you think, in the history of filmed fighting, including the second Louis Schmeling?
That's always really hard to say. I've seen a lot of beatings over the years. There's been a lot of brutal fights. He probably suffered less damage in 3 rounds from Dempsey than some guys suffer in 12 or 15 rounds. And that maybe they don't get knocked out or they get knocked out late, but just the overall cumulative damage that they suffer in round after round after round does more to destroy their minds, their brains, their careers. So it's hard. So, I'll tell you, one of the most brutal fights I ever saw was Riddick Bowe versus Andrew Galata.
Yeah.
Particularly the second fight. It was such a brutal. I don't think either one of them were ever the same again.
No, absolutely. And certainly, having met Bowe, it affected him mentally after the fight. I mean, that was a vicious beating.
Yeah.
With Willard, there was a book that came out on Willard in the last couple of years, and it purported to it showed a photograph of a pristine face and said this is what he really looked like. But after the fight, but when I did Cinderella Man, I was privileged. Angelo Dundee introduced me to Bud Schulberg, and he sat 4th row with his father, who was head of Paramount Films. So he was there, and he said you wouldn't recognize Willard, that his nose was broken, teeth were knocked out. He said people were at ringside, were reaching into the ring to grab the teeth that Willard had lost. And, there was a point where his father put his hand over Bud's face because he was saying it was just, he'd never seen a human take a beating like that. It was like he'd been attacked by a gang.
Well, I mean, Dempsey did pulverize him very badly. I mean, dropped him 7 times in the first round. But Willard got up and continued and fought 2 more rounds and actually did okay. I mean, he was still getting pounded on, but he actually nailed Dempsey a few good ones here and there, and he was trying his best. I think they overblew how badly he was hurt in that fight. I mean, he was very badly hurt, but boxing history has a way of getting more and more colorful and fanciful as time goes on.
Right.
And even Jess Willard himself was like, "Look, I wasn't really that badly hurt. I'm fine. I'm good." But there were people who said, yes, definitely he got some teeth knocked out, because back then they didn't really wear the kind of mouthpieces we wear today. I mean, they may not have worn mouthpieces at all, let alone any mouthpiece.
Not until Ted Kid Lewis, yeah.
So did he get some teeth knocked out? There's verification in the newspaper reports that yes, he did. Was his face, crushed and broken bones and broken ribs the way they say? I don't think so. No, there's no real evidence of that. Was his face, pulpy and a bit bloodied up? Yes. I mean, he's getting hit by, a massive puncher who's wearing, 5 or 6 ounce gloves and getting just teed off on. So, these things happen. But, it wasn't anything that he needed reconstructive surgery for or anything like that.
Why do you think Jack Del Kearns, his manager, by the way, when did Kearns and Dempsey, when and where did they hook up?
It appears to be somewhere in 1917. I'd say, early to mid 1917 is when Kearns and he started working together. I think Kearns loaned him some money and basically said, "Hey, I think you've got some potential. You need to work on some of the things, polish up your offense, work on some of your defense. But I think you got real raw potential, and let's work together." and eventually they did.
And before him, he had a sketchy guy in New York, John the Barber Riesling, who tried to set him up with a fight with Sam Langford. And can you tell us about that? How Dempsey skipped out on that?
Well, that's another interesting thing. I'm not so sure that's true.
Okay.
Dempsey claimed it in his final autobiography, but he never claimed it before that. And the autobiographies he did, years earlier, didn't mention Langford. He mentioned other guys, and in fact, even the other guys he mentioned may not have been the true guys that he was considering being put in with. If you look at the actual primary source newspaper reports of who Riesler was looking to put him in with, it's not Langford. It was guys like Frank Moran and Ed Gunboat Smith, and actually the most likely guy. Well, you'll read my book.
Yes, absolutely. And I look forward to reading that. But what you're saying, you bring up a very good point that this lost you for a sec here on the screen. But Dempsey, I mean, in boxing, that happens all the time where things get embellished. So it's frustrating sometimes because you're not sure what the actual truth is, which is what's so great about your books, is that you're able to clear it up and get the actual factual thing. Oh, we got you back, Adam.
Okay.
Yeah. So what you're saying about that, how boxing gets embellished over the years. I have to tell you a short, quick story. When I was at the Hall of Fame, I was in the lunchroom once with Angelo Dundee, my mentor, and we're walking out with Carmen Basilio, and Carmen sees Emil Griffith, and just says to him, "Get out of the way, Nancy boy." And Griffith takes a swing at Basilio and hits Angelo. Basilio takes a swing at Griffith and hits Angelo. And by the time we got outside the building, it was Griffith or Basilio used the N-word. These guys squared off and had a fight. We're fighting for 10 minutes. It was like a 4-second thing. So I can well understand what you're saying about the fact that, things like that get embellished over time. So it's not even likely then, I guess, that Langford was one of his potential opponents. But he said after that was the guy that he feared. Was that just why would he say something like that, to assuage his guilt at not fighting black fighters, or is it just he was just a kind person that way?
Yeah, I mean, you can always speculate on what's in a person's mind, but obviously at that point, Langford was past. Dempsey knew Langford was a great fighter, and yeah, Dempsey, could sometimes be humble and self-effacing, and back then it was a much more lauded quality to be humble, and I could see Dempsey just saying something like that, like, "Oh, I was afraid of Sam Langford,"
Because he was the one who took Langford to that night for Langford, I think, at the Polo Grounds or Yankee Stadium. He was the one that escorted him in, but he certainly saw Langford fight.
Yeah, say something about Sam Langford is Sam Langford was very high on Dempsey as well during his career. Usually, when they interviewed Sam Langford about Dempsey, he said very nice things about Dempsey, and he would say, Dempsey's the best in the world. He'll beat anyone, and maybe that also may have influenced Dempsey on saying nice things about Langford years later, because Langford was very high on Dempsey.
Well, this brings up an interesting fact: the Harry Wills fight that never happened. Dempsey, and you know better than anyone, feasted on taller fighters. And it really was Kearns that didn't want to fight. Do you think Dempsey would have gone through with the fight against Wills? It's hard to believe he would have had any fear of Wills at that stage in Wills' career, or any stage, because he did great against taller fighters.
Well, that's an internal debate about, and that you're going to have to read the 2 books on that. I'm working on a 3rd now.
Wow.
If you read the books, you're going to get a lot of different perspectives on who avoided who and why and what thwarted that fight, and was Dempsey afraid? Was Kearns afraid? Was Rickard afraid? Was it politics, etc.? Was it economics? There's a lot to it. I don't want to spoil it, but I'm gonna lay it all out: the pros, the cons, the arguments for, against, every argument, and I just basically let the reader decide what they think the truth is.
Well, there was a Canadian magazine in the 70s, which it still had an article on Larry Gaines. And Gaines apparently was brought in for a day or two to be a sparring partner. And Doc Kearns said to him, if you were white, I'd drop Dempsey and go with you, which I don't believe for a second that he said. But they said that, guys like Gaines and other black fighters are kept away from Dempsey. But I just find it hard to believe, because unlike Sullivan, who didn't fight, he only fought white guys, and there were great fighters, Peter Jackson in his time, Dempsey, skill level wise, was so far, wouldn't you agree, was so far above everyone else?
Well, that's tough to say. Do I think his skill level was so far above everyone else? Not necessarily, but I think he had a certain brand of speed and explosive power that even if he was less skilled than some of his opponents, it didn't matter. As soon as he hit him, it was over.
Right. It's like that old saying that gets credited to Tyson, but I was told that Lewis said it first. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. I mean, Dempsey was smart defensively, though, as well, because after the first Schmeling fight, he went to Lewis's camp and showed him what he could do in certain situations.
I mean, Dempsey had a brand of skill set that was tailored for effectiveness, for him to be effective given his talents and his style. He may not have been the most brilliant defensive specialist in the world, but he had a good brand of defense. He had footwork. He had side footwork. He had good head movement, side to side, turns and dips and weaves, to where when people would hit him, they weren't hitting him as effectively. Plus, he also had an iron jaw. Right. But back then, it was more about effectiveness, not about necessarily just point scoring. It was about doing damage and are you going to knock a guy out eventually? And so, like James J. Jeffries, who also said, look, I get hit. Sure, I get hit, but I make sure they don't hit me in a place where it's going to get me, knock me down or stop me. So he knew how to get hit and roll and ride with punches, but then slide forward off of that and then come at his opponent and hit him right back. And he'd actually use them throwing a punch as a way to open themselves up for his counterattack as he's aggressively moving forward. And that's something that also Mike Tyson was very good at. He was a specialist at it, and people appreciated it.
And that's a lost art in today's boxing for a lot of fighters.
Yep. And also Marciano. Marciano was great at it. Joe Frazier was great at it. So,
To lessen the impact of the punch by rolling with the punch.
Yes.
There's some fighters recently, though, like James Toney and Bud Crawford, who are almost like a throwback to that era in terms of their defensive skill.
Yeah. I mean, look at every era's got great fighters. We can debate about whether they were better back then or they're better now. But the truth is, every era's got some great fighters. There's some great fighters from yesteryear could fight today, and there's some great fighters today that could fight in yesteryear. And you just have to adapt to the different conditions. But great fighters are great fighters, and they find ways to win.
With Dempsey, I've read so many times, the name Rachel Solomon has come up. That was his paternal grandmother? Is that correct?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. It said he had Jewish blood in him, that his father's mother or grandmother was Rachel Solomon. But I've never seen any proof of that. I've just heard the name mentioned.
No, I'm not aware of that.
Oh, okay.
As far as I'm aware, John L. Sullivan was of Irish ancestry, as far as I know.
Okay. Like the original Jack Dempsey.
Oh, well, so, I mean, who are we talking about? Are we talking about Sullivan, or are we talking about...
Oh, no, we're talking about Jack Dempsey.
Oh, Jack Dempsey? There was a rumor that he did, but I don't know that was ever proven. I think Dempsey had more of the Irish, European. He had a touch of Native American as well on both sides. But I'm not aware of anything that would demonstrate that he had any Jewish ancestry.
Okay. Would you say that Dempsey's greatest victory was to fight with Furpo or to fight with Willard or another fight? In other words, when you look back, the most amazing fight, his most amazing victory, would it be the Willard because he was the underdog? Or would it be Furpo because Furpo dropped him and then knocked him out of the ring? People thought it was finished at that time. Or another fight, perhaps.
I mean, I think it's just his totality of work is he mowed down most of the top contenders in 1918 and was destroying them, and people just admired and appreciated what he was doing because he's fighting guys with 50, 60, 70 pro fights and stopping them in 1 or 2 rounds. So people couldn't even believe their eyes. And yeah, Willard was a huge, strong guy, and even after like several years off after the Dempsey fight, Willard came back and won some good fights and proved that he was a pretty tough guy. And even in losses, showed he was a real fighter. So that was a big fight. I mean, at the time, the Carpentier fight was huge. Carpentier, sure, look at nowadays we talk about how great a fighter is, and then they go and lose a fight, and we talk about they were overrated, they were nothing. Just because you lose a fight doesn't mean you're not a really good fighter. Carpentier was a really good fighter. He was very well respected, and before the fight, a lot of people thought he had a legitimate chance of beating Dempsey. Just because Dempsey mowed through him doesn't mean he wasn't a heck of a fighter. So, the right hands and hooks that Carpentier hit Dempsey with in the second round, 9 times out of 10 in his career, Carpentier would have scored a knockout. Most of the guys he hit like that, he dropped. If he couldn't drop Dempsey, Dempsey had an iron jaw. But does that mean that Carpentier wasn't a heck of a fighter? No. It was that you don't generate the first $1 million gate because people think it's a total mismatch. Some people did, but people were very intrigued by the fight.
Well, Carpentier killed, but knocked out Ted Kid Lewis in 1 round, and Lewis was a great fighter. And Carpentier got there first. Didn't Carpentier break his right hand on Dempsey's jaw?
Yes, he did. So, but I don't think that it would have changed the result even if he hadn't broken his hand.
Well, was it true Dempsey used to soak his hands in beef brine and chew pine tar gum and for his jaw? He did all these things that fighters don't do today to toughen his chin up and toughen his skin up on his hands.
Yeah, I mean, some of those things may be of questionable effectiveness, but yeah, he did a lot of that kind of stuff.
Bud Schulberg said that in the Willard fight, he was in a dressing room he was only 8 to 10 years old with his father, but he said Willard's trainer was there, and he said that trainer said that Dempsey's wraps and gloves were kosher, they were fine. And you see him entering the ring, there's photos of him with just the wraps. Where was this just saying that his hands were plaster of Paris? Gil Clancy told me one time that's ridiculous because he said if you had plaster of Paris, you couldn't lift your hands, and if you did and hit somebody, you'd break every bone in your hand. Where did this come about? Was this Kearns trying to make money for that, or was it Willard looking to save face for such a bad beating?
Well, Willard's not even the one that came up with that claim. It was made by some people that may not have even seen the fight, but they just couldn't believe. They read stories about how badly Willard had been, beat up, and they couldn't believe that he could only be stopped in 3 rounds. And so, they said, well, he must have had loaded gloves, but they didn't stop and think about the fact that Dempsey was an explosive puncher, fast starter, been mowing through the whole heavyweight division quickly. And Willard hadn't fought in 3 years, so he probably wasn't at his absolute sharpest. And so Dempsey did what Dempsey does. And the truth is, Dempsey came into the ring without his gloves on. He had his wraps on. So he was right there for everyone to examine his wraps. There's primary source articles that indicate that Dempsey's wraps were examined by Willard's seconds. Willard himself shook Dempsey's wrapped hands in the ring.
Right.
So I think this is a total myth. But people just sort of speculated like, oh, he couldn't have done that to Willard unless he had loaded wraps. And so, and even Jimmy DeForest years later, his trainer said, that loaded wrap story is just total garbage. If anything, that would have made Dempsey's hands heavier, and that's not what we were trying to do to beat Willard. We weren't trying to beat him with power. We were trying to beat him with speed, and to weight his hands down with something heavy like plaster. That would have been counterproductive. So it's not something we would have ever thought of doing at all. And we didn't need to.
I have to tell you, my father would go to the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto every year. And in the 1960s, Willard would come up every year and he'd be in a booth and he'd give a talk. This is 63, 64. And he would take, my father spoke to him for like 30 seconds, but he had a piece of barbed wire. And he said, this is what Dempsey had in his gloves. And my father said, which really annoyed Willard, I thought it was plaster of Paris. And Willard didn't like that. He just turned away. And then years later, Jack Duck Kearns say in Sports Illustrated, he got paid to say that the gloves are in fact loaded because he needed the money.
Yeah. It's, look, people say things for money all the time. And I don't think there's any proof of that claim. And I think Kearns had some sour grapes towards Dempsey, which the books will go over the reasons why. But back to your discussion of Dempsey's great fights with Furpo, it was a phenomenal fight. It was considered like the best fight of all time at the time that Dempsey beat Furpo, because it was just an awesome war. They just basically just went to town on each other, slugging away with bombs, and it was just a non-stop slugfest. And people just loved the fight. Both of them down multiple times, and it made Dempsey bigger than ever. So maybe that should be considered his greatest victory. I don't know, but it was certainly his most exciting, and it garnered him tremendous respect. And anyone who suspected that Dempsey loaded his gloves didn't believe it after that, because they saw what they did. He did a huge, strong Furpo. And even Jess Willard, after that fight, he said, yeah, now I see how Dempsey did what he did to me. Because basically he just witnessed Dempsey do to Furpo what he did to Willard. In fact, Willard lasted longer than Furpo did. Furpo got knocked out in the first minute of the second round. Willard actually went 3 full rounds with Dempsey. So that fight kind of showed Willard something where he's like, yeah, I get it now. This guy is just just an explosive, fast starting guy, and you can't you just can't avoid him, and he's going to hit you with bombs.
Yeah, I that's one of the great things about your book, because I did not know that Willard had said that about after the Furpo fight. One of the things that came out of the Furpo fight was the fact that Furpo said that he should have won because Dempsey was out of the ring for seconds, and you're supposed to get back into the ring under your own ability without the help of whoever, the writers at this point, pushing him back in. Was that rule in place at that time in boxing in New York?
So, well, the facts are disputed. Most of the writers said Dempsey beat the 10 count. In fact, the films make it appear that he got in there like almost instantly. Like he was and a lot of the writers also said he got back within like 4 to 5 seconds. It was like he went out and he just climbed right back on in. So, and there's some people that try to make, there's a lot of yellow journalism. People like to make, fanciful stories and good copy and try to create controversy. It sells papers, but the vast majority of the writers said he got back in the ring pretty quickly. There was some debate about whether he had any assistance. Some people said he had aid. Some people said he didn't. Some people said it was more like Dempsey falling into the laps of writers, and writers sort of putting their arms out and trying to like push him off of them because he'd fallen into their faces, and it's more like an act of self-preservation. But like the fact is, grabbing the ropes, climbing back on through, getting back into the ring, and continuing on immediately, pretty quickly.
Okay, yeah, that it's interesting to me of the scenario of the first Cooper Ali fight or Clay fight, and everyone says, Cassius Clay had 4 minutes or half an hour to recover, but I saw an interview of Henry Cooper. He said he got an extra 15 seconds, maybe 20 at the most. So people, over time, he had a half an hour, he had a week and a half in the Bahamas, but it's Cooper said no. He said Muhammad had 10, 15 seconds. That was the difference. That's all it took. So, as you're saying, this yellow journalism that that keeps popping up. One thing I wondered about Dempsey is, in looking back at the mob's control of boxing, they didn't really get into it before his Carpentier fight because the money wasn't worth it to them. But only the killer Madden from 23 on really controlled boxing. And how did Dempsey circumvent that? Was that through Kearns? Because Kearns was definitely connected with the mob, because you could see that with when he had Mickey Walker and Archie Moore. How did Dempsey, was he able to go out on his own and not be affected by them, or was he affected by them?
I'm not aware of any mob affiliation in his career at all. I've not seen any primary source evidence for it.
Okay, I've read that Capone came to him, but those stories are apocryphal. I mean, Capone came and offered to fix the fight for him, and with Tunney and Capone this and that, but there's no real evidence, I guess. Apparently, Boo Boo, the Philly gangster, was the one who got the fight, along with Russell Peltz told me Taylor, I think it was. Is it Herman Taylor, the promoter from Philly, that helped move the fight to Philly from New York, the Tunney fight, because he wouldn't fight Wills, so they had the New York State Athletic Commission would let him fight there.
Okay, well, now you're getting into my third book, which hasn't been published yet. But that's all going to be discussed in the third book. Yeah, so Boo Boo Hoff was a character, and that was somewhat perhaps involved in the first Dempsey-Tunney fight. And to be continued. There was a little controversy over that, and that's going to be discussed in the third book. That it was more vis-a-vis Tunney than Dempsey was Hoff's involvement in the fight.
Right.
Is that Hoff allegedly had a contract with Tunney, and there wound up being some litigation and some controversy in the newspapers over that.
He lent them money.
Well, that was the dispute. Did he owe the money?
Right. So I think what we'll, when we get Adam back, I think one of the things we can do is mention that the phone, if he could turn his phone off sleep mode, that would be good. But what I heard was the fact that your phone goes on sleep mode, I think.
Sorry about that.
What's happening.
We got disconnected or something.
Well, oh, okay. It just says here your phone's going on sleep mode, so I'm not sure.
Right.
So, I mean, who knows? I know Roger Kahn wrote that the mob was involved, but Bert Sugar said to me, that's completely false. The fight was on the level, and Dempsey just didn't listen. So this brings up the other question, which will be in your third book. Dempsey said that if he had gone to the neutral corner in the second fight, the Battle of the Long Count, immediately, that he believes Tunney would have beaten the count. Was that him being modest? Or did he really? It's hard to believe he really believed that.
Well, that was the big debate, and it helped make Dempsey more of a legend because people thought he got robbed, and a lot of the big Dempsey fans were like, yeah, if there hadn't been a long count, Dempsey would have knocked him out, finished him off, and he would have regained the championship, and it helped create some Dempsey lore and aura, and sometimes when people think you've been wronged in some way, you can kind of ride off into the sunset even bigger than you were before. Sort of like, a lot of people thought George Foreman deserved to beat Shannon Briggs, and sort of that's his last fight, and he kind of rode off into the sunset with a lot of people on his side feeling that he should have still been champion and got robbed or whatever. But I mean, the truth is, do I really think he was going to stop Tunney, even if the count had been 4 or 5 seconds less. No, I don't. Not based on what I've seen on the films. And in fact, you're going into my third book now, which hasn't been published yet, but stay tuned. There's more to that long count than meets the eye, and I think Dempsey was inevitably going to give Tunney some extra time because there's lots of different ways that Dempsey kind of screwed that one up. But we'll talk about that later.
Right. Okay. I was just gonna mention Dave Barry because the thing was he had done work for Bubohoff, and it's and I noticed it's your third book coming up, but it mentions how when Dempsey goes down in the 8th round, Barry's right there to start the count. He doesn't tell Tunney to go to neutral corner, but it's just hard to believe that was deliberate. It seems more that was just human reaction.
Well, I mean, there's different ways of looking at that. You have to understand that, one, there is a neutral corner rule, but there isn't a mandatory 8 count like we have today.
Right.
So as soon as you get up, the fight immediately resumes. So some might say that Dempsey was foolish for getting up so quickly because, yes, he went down, but he got up within a second. So by getting up within a second, it kind of I think it threw Barry off because the question is, does he send him to the neutral corner rule, send him to the neutral corner and cease counting or suspend the count the way he did with Tunney? But then again, why do I need a count? Dempsey's now up. Let's just let the fight resume. Right. So there was that moment of, he was kind of coming in and then he kind of just decided to back away and let the fight resume because there's no mandatory 8 count.
Right. That's a great point. So in that sense, Dempsey's his own worst enemy.
So the real question would be is if Dempsey had stayed down, would he have suspended the count and forced Tunney to go to the neutral corner before taking up the count?
And we'll never know.
Exactly.
Now, I've read various accounts, of Dempsey when he fought fireman Jim Flynn and got knocked out, that he was starving. He had to walk 5 or 10 miles to the arena or to the city for the fight. But his wife at the time, Maxine, who was a prostitute, said that he had thrown the fight. Hard to believe Dempsey would throw the fight, but maybe if he was starving enough, perhaps. But when they had the rematch, he had no problem with Flynn. Do you think Dempsey threw that fight?
That's an eternal debate. I put forth the arguments for him throwing the fight and against him throwing the fight. And, I kind of let the readers decide.
That's great. Well, that's one of the many great things about your book, right? That you let the readers decide. You give them the truth and these facts, and they decide. Do you think personally that he threw the fight, or are you just presenting the facts and saying you decide?
So I present the facts of what makes it look like a legit knockout, and I also present the facts of a lot of different people who were there said that fight was fixed, including his own wife, who said he fixed the fight while she was still married to him. It wasn't like she said it years later after she was divorced from him. She was still his wife, and it was 2 months after the fight. She was going to a San Francisco newspaper writer saying, "My husband threw that fight." So, but Dempsey at the time said, "No, I didn't. She's just upset at me, for various reasons, and she's just trying to hurt me." But years later, there's interviews with a lot of people involved with the fight that they had information before the fight that it was fixed, and there's allusions to potentially Dempsey had, in his own way admitting that he had fixed the fight, that he regretted doing it, but he did it for the money because he was so poor and his family was in dire straits at the time, and he had to come up with some money, quickly, and he was offered a good amount of money for him at the time to do it.
What would be his wife's motivation for saying that? Is it because she was divorcing him at the time, or?
No, they didn't actually get divorced for another almost 2 years.
Okay.
But they were separated. I think there may have been brief reunifications at various times. The second book, In the Ring with Jack Dempsey, Part 2, 1919 to 1923, goes into that a lot. A lot came out in the newspapers at the time of Dempsey's draft dodging trial, and while those criminal charges were pending, the newspapers did more investigation. They found a lot about her. They found out a lot about the allegations that she made against him. as well as the allegation regarding the fixed fight against Jim Flynn. Things came out in the papers at that time in 1920, which was 2 to 3 years later. But and also she testified at the trial, which some salacious details came out in the papers previous to that, and even during the trial, that's when it came out that she basically admitted under oath that she was a prostitute. Yeah, I mean, it's all in the book. I don't want to spoil it. You're making me spoil my own book here.
Well, it's a huge book. I mean, I don't think you can spoil it. You're just whetting people's appetites for. I mean, Dempsey was branded a slacker because he was wearing the patent leather shoes in that famous photo in a shipyard. But Dempsey really wasn't a slacker. I mean, his family were his dependents. He had to support them. Wasn't that correct?
Well, so at the time, there were various exemptions from military service. And yeah, he claimed those exemptions, and they granted his exemption. Years later, various people were just still upset that he hadn't voluntarily joined. And his wife said he was a slacker and had engaged in a conspiracy to avoid the draft. That got, that led to criminal charges against him, for which he was acquitted. In fact, once the case was given to the jury, they acquitted him very quickly. He had a pretty solid defense. And, I go into the trial, at great length, and you'll see what the testimony was. You'll see what the evidence was, and you can make up your own mind. But even though he was found not guilty, people don't realize this is because we're talking about what a great big figure Dempsey is and how beloved he is. At the time, he was not beloved. He was thought of as a draft dodger and a slacker for years, even after he was acquitted. He was actually kind of a loathed figure, even though people loved watching him fight. There was this interesting dichotomy or an oxymoron, or whatever you want to call it, where they loved watching him fight, and his fight because they saw him as a draft dodger, so they wanted to see him lose. And so he never really kicked that image.
It's an interesting thing because at that time, around that era, Fatty Arbuckle was acquitted for Virginia Rapay, I think it was, or whatever her name was. He was accused of raping, and they admitted, Rapay and her handler admitted they did this to a lot of other men. They were accused them that Arbuckle was in the hotel suite, but was not in her room, and actually had never met her. Yet it ruined her career. The people didn't care. And like you're saying, this followed Dempsey, although, it looks like perhaps it wasn't true, but I guess people today don't understand the fact how big, this was the first the war to end all wars. So for Dempsey not to participate, I guess being the heavyweight champion of the world, while other people had to, would have been looked on askance by so many people.
And that's something that the book hits on, is just how upset people were at Dempsey for not going into the military. I mean, it was like this theme throughout the book. There's a lot of saltiness and bitterness towards him. Even at the same time, they liked him personally and they loved his style. It really bothered a lot of people that he hadn't joined up in the military. It's sort of like, it kind of gives you a little moment of pause to understand why Muhammad Ali / Cassius Clay was so loathed at the time in the 60s when he wouldn't join up. And I guess if you really want to see just how America, saw that patriotism as very important, as the heavyweight champion or a top contender joining up voluntarily, it was such a big deal to them. You could kind of look at Dempsey's life and career, and that's sort of a harbinger of how loathed Ali was for not joining, and because they really disliked Dempsey. A lot of people did, because he didn't voluntarily join. Regarding that photo you mentioned with the patent leather shoes, that was obviously not him working. So one of the ways you got around working, being in the military, there was something called a work or fight order, that if you're not fighting, you had to be working in an essential industry that would help towards the war. And so, one of the things you could do would be to be a welder or, work building ships or something of that nature. And so one of his claims was that's what he was doing. When the reality is, if he did do that, it was probably very limited in time. He really was just a professional boxer at the time. But in his defense, he said that the military had asked him to do that for recruiting purposes. So they staged these photos at the military's request. And he said, look, whatever they asked me to do, I did. They asked me to stage these photos because he was a top contender at the time. And that would help garner publicity for the recruitment, war effort recruitment. And so these photos were posed, but it wasn't at his request. It was at the military's request. He did it for them, And he also argued that he was donating a lot of his purses. That's another thing that people don't want to sort of acknowledge about him is he fought for free a lot of times. He donated several of his purses, and he fought for nothing. So including against Willie Meehan, the fight that he lost the 4-round decision. He said he was injured going into that fight, but because he was doing it to earn money for the military and for the Soldiers and Sailors Relief Fund, he didn't want to pull out of the fight, even with a badly injured hand. His hand was actually broken going into the fight. And he said, look, this is for the military. I want to make them money. And it wound up generating well over $20,000 that he didn't make a dime off of that. So, he had a lot of good arguments on his side. It's like, hey, I still did my part.
Well, it's interesting when you look at, it sort of relates to Joe Louis, because Louis, under different circumstances, but he volunteered immediately to go into the Army, I guess, which is why a lot of, part of his team, part of Lewis's Roxborough and Black and Jacobs, they made sure that Lewis volunteered right away because they're always looking out for Lewis's image to make sure that, this was a patriotic, loyal American. But you bring up a fantastic point with Jack Dempsey that, in the Second World War, I believe he volunteered and was in Okinawa, and it apparently, from what I understand, Angelo told me, and Ferdy Pacheco, Muhammad's doctor, who met Dempsey when he was young, but he couldn't say anything to him because he was so starstruck. He tried to talk, he couldn't get the words out. Said that even in his later years, it bothered Dempsey that he was called a slacker. That he never really got over the hurt of that because he said it just wasn't true.
Yeah, many years later in World War II, he joined the Coast Guard, and I think that was, psychologically, I think his way of saying, "Hey, I want to do my part." Because I think it did always bother him, those accusations.
Now, this is sort of a silly question because it's been asked about everyone, but did Hollywood ruin Jack Dempsey, Estelle Taylor, who Jack Duck Kearns did not like? Kearns just wanted to keep Dempsey on the straight and narrow, just keep fighting, keep making money. Did he, he had 3 years off. I guess that was really what, that really hurt him career-wise and skill-wise, because he didn't really care at that point.
Yeah, that's going to be my third book on Dempsey, and I'm going to in great detail what was going on, not only in Dempsey's life and career during the 3 years that he was sitting on the shelf and not fighting, but also what's going on in boxing and the world and with other contenders, Harry Wills, Gene Tunney, Harry Greb, all of them. I'm going to paint the picture for everyone, and you all can make a decision about what ruined Dempsey, but at the end of the day, we all have to take personal responsibility for our own decisions. But, there's a lot of reasons for why he sat out as long as he did. And I'll lay it out there, and you can decide what you want to believe.
I know that there's several times when they're all having dinner together and Kearns verbally laid into Estelle Taylor. Chris Dundee said, if that was my wife and someone had done that, I'd kill them. You don't talk to someone's wife like that. But Kearns was what I guess Frazier called a scambooga. He was a rogue, but he was successful. He knew how to get along in the boxing business. Is it true that he served a summons to Dempsey while Dempsey was in the ring?
It wasn't while he was in the ring, but it was before the first Tunney fight. That yes, he did sue him for his share of the purse. and that was, Dempsey had to deal with a bunch of litigation before the first Tunney fight, which again the book goes into.
Right. It's it's hard to believe when you read about it that, from what I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, if it's true or not, that the purse would be paid to the manager, to Kearns, and he'd give Dempsey his purse, but often he considered the whole thing his money, and he would gamble it away or whatever, and give parcel the money out to Dempsey. And wasn't there a point where Tex Rickard just said, you're getting screwed here? So Dempsey would take the money, and then Rickard or Kearns would be furious, but Dempsey said, "There's no reason to be furious. You're getting your percentage as agreed."
I mean, that's tough to answer. I mean, Dempsey and Kearns for many years operated without a written contract. They basically had a pretty darn good amicable relationship from 1917 all the way through, past 1923, 1924. Obviously that changed, but they got along well enough that they didn't even need a contract.
Right.
They were operating on a 50-50 split, which today we would think.
I don't think a 50-50 split. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
We lost you. So you said they were operating on a 50-50 split?
They were operating on a 50-50 split. And at some point, they signed, before the Furpo fight, the New York State Athletic Commission forced them to sign and file a formal contract. And but they would not allow a split greater than a third. They would only allow a manager to make a third. A 33 1/3% was the legal maximum in New York. So they filed a written contract for Kearns to get a third. And there's more to the story on that as well, which will be mostly covered in the third book.
So, in other words, when these stories come out, you're just hearing the headlines. You're not hearing the story behind it, which is the great thing about your book. And one reason why so many people, especially Thomas Hauser, loves your book is you're giving the full story. You're telling exactly from all points of view what happened.
I try to, if I can, I try to come at it from multiple different angles and perspectives. I try to get multiple primary sources if I can, and to give different perspectives and let the reader decide what they think's the truth.
It's a tricky question, I guess, but you obviously have your own opinion, but you don't reveal that to the readers. In other words, you want them to decide on their own.
Well, I mean, there's always going to be what the author thinks is the truth, and
Right.
I think that's gonna, potentially, even if on a subconscious level, it's gonna maybe come through, if not overtly, if potentially subtly. But there's some times where I'm not really sure myself, and I'm just gonna. I mean, even if I am sure, I'm still gonna put the other side just because it makes it a fun story, and it also shows people what was being said at the time. I mean, like, we can watch a fight today, and like 90% of us think someone won the fight, and 10% think the other guy won. But I mean, do we just completely omit the 10%, or do we still say, hey, there was some people that said this? So I try to do that. Say, hey, look, the vast majority said this. Here's a sampling of the people who said this about the fight, but there's a minority opinion, and much fewer said this. But here it is. Here's what the minority opinion said, and I would still give a sample of that. The fights with more controversy, where you've got a greater split, half people or 60% say one way, 40% say the other, or 55-45, then I'm going to have a lot greater sampling of, here's all the people that said this guy won, here's all the people that said this guy won, and I'll give samplings of why they said this guy won, or why this guy won, and I'll let the reader make their own conclusion of. But even if we can't see the fight, by reading about all the different perspectives on the fight, you can kind of get a general gist of how the fight went down, what were the strengths and the weaknesses of the different fighters, what were the judges looking at. If a judge looked for this, they'd kind of lean towards this guy. If you look for this kind of quality, they lean towards this guy. And just like today, we see a fight, and you can have a divergence of opinion on a judge's decision.
Right. Well, a couple weeks ago, the George Kambosos Maxie Hughes fight, and people were outraged that Kambosos won. I thought Hughes won, but Angelo told me a long time ago, if you watch a fight on TV, turn the sound off. You don't want to be influenced by the broadcasters. So,
Yeah.
Judge it from that aspect. When you're looking at these myths, let's call them, over some fights from 100 years ago, Dempsey and Bob Fitzsimmons, Marvin Hart, Tommy Burns, are you also looking at it because you're a lawyer from a legal perspective? In other words, this is what they claim, but there's really no evidence. You can't say this because they're claiming it, but there's virtually no evidence to back up such an assertion.
Yeah, because you get a lot of these sort of fanciful myths and legends and stories, but then the question is, what is the actual evidence? And what do we believe the real truth is, and is there something to back it up? So I try to look at the evidence. Yeah, from perhaps I find some of the legal aspects of these stories to be interesting, and I like to try to uncover what the truth is to the extent possible, but often there's shades of gray. And like I said, I'll put forth multiple perspectives and, let people figure out what they think is more likely to be true.
Dempsey was also popular in Europe. I mean, in England and France and Germany, and he just captured the world. Why was he able to do? Was it the knockouts, his ferociousness, that captured the imagination of the entire world?
Yeah, even though you couldn't legally transport films from state to state in the U.S., you could transport them overseas. So it's possible that many Europeans had seen more of Dempsey than a lot of Americans had, because they could transport the films, copy them, and put them in theaters and make a bunch of money that way. And he was exciting to watch. I mean, even now, if you watch some of his fights, they're fun to watch, even to this day. Like, the guy's
Right.
really exciting to watch. And same thing, like I said, like Mike Tyson, 100 years from now, his fights will still be fun to watch. So, and also he also did movies, so that also helped too. That was, back then the 1920s was they call it a roaring 20s for a reason. Like, movies were big back then, and that's the era of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, and people
Douglas
went to the movies a
Fairbanks.
lot. Like, there was no such thing as TV. You had to go to the movies. So Dempsey also did a lot of movies.
There's great photos of him with Douglas Fairbanks on his shoulder, of Charlie Chaplin, Harry Houdini, and Mary Pickford. So yeah, I mean, those photos went worldwide.
Yeah, and that also goes towards what caused Dempsey to sit on the shelf is the movie industries was one of the part of the reasons of why he's making a ton of money in the movies.
Right.
So it's like, do you want to get $1 million for acting, or do you want to get less than that for getting hit in the head and maybe losing your crown potentially? So it's like, economics has a lot to do with it as well.
Well, it's easy to see that in a lot of in boxing throughout history, but also in other professions. Jim Carrey was a great stand-up, but then once he said, I started to get 20, 30 million a picture, I didn't want to go back on the road. Same as Steve Martin. Why bother? I don't want to go out and tour and do these towns and have to put up with working in new material. And you look at Dempsey, I mean, it makes sense that he'd want to do that. He achieved his goal. He was the best heavyweight, the best fighter on the planet. Why, as you're saying, why bother going in to get more punches?
And keep in mind also, like, to continue to answer your question about why Dempsey was so big in Europe, is also because Europeans, goes back to the Carpentier fight, is Europeans greatly admired Carpentier. I mean, he was very, very big in Europe. They'd seen him fight, many, many times. His films had been, his fights had been filmed. They'd been shown in Europe. He was very highly respected out there. And so when Dempsey mowed through him, that, shot Dempsey's esteem up greatly in Europe.
Well, it's a question I have for you, and I guess you'll cover this in your third book. It's incredible how universally loved Dempsey was, especially by the people he fought. I mean, Carpentier loved him. Furpo gave him money, apparently, when he went to visit him in Argentina. He gave money to Billy Misk. He helped out paid for Bill Brennan's funeral. I mean, all the people that knew him in the sport and fought against him loved him. What was it about Dempsey that he was just such a kind, respectful person, or was it his charisma or his personality?
Yeah, I mean, that's also, extensively covered in the book is like just as a general, just a guy, he was very well liked. He was very easygoing. Certain people have that personality where people get along with him very well. And Dempsey was one of those guys that people seemed to like him. He seemed to like people. He was a people's kind of guy. He liked hanging out with people. He was the kind of guy who would come up to you and how you doing and slap you on the back and, chat it up with you. Is very
Right.
certain fighters are gruff and standoffish and more introverted, and I mean, we are who we are, but Dempsey did have a certain magnetism and people liked him. I mean, even writers liked him. They said, out of the ring he's a really likable guy. In the ring he's an absolute monstrous brute and just a killer, but outside the ring he's a really pleasant, likable guy.
Yeah, Bert Sugar told me, I mean, it's a well-known story. When he first came to New York in the 50s and he was looking in Dempsey's restaurant, and he saw this big cutout poster of Dempsey, and he couldn't believe it. And actually, it was Dempsey. And he came out and said, "How you doing? Who are you?" And he said, "I just moved to New York. I want to be a boxing writer." And Dempsey said, "Come on in. I'll give you your first scoop." And so Ferdy Pacheco told me he was like that with everyone. He was just such a nice guy and so generous with people that you couldn't help but love him. In fact, when Dempsey died, the reporter on this is a Toronto news station, a reporter who was in his 30s at the time, who didn't know Dempsey and may not have known of Dempsey, but he was in tears delivering the story, as so many were, because this was the guy that was just embraced by the world. He was really one of the best things. Would you agree that he, helped popularize the sport, and really one of the best things about boxing was the character of Jack Dempsey? He was real Americana.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Dempsey and promoter Tex Rickard, they brought boxing to new heights in the 1920s. And it also like goes to the dichotomy we're talking about. On one hand, Dempsey's loathed for not going into the military, but on a personal level, they really liked him. And that also reminds me of Jack Johnson. Is like, at the same time, the General Society is hating him for multiple reasons. A lot of the writers said on a personal level, the guy's a really cool guy, and he's like easy to talk to and get along, and he makes for great copy, and he gives us good interviews, and he's a writer's fighter. And so it's like interesting interplay between here's this really likable, nice guy, but at the same time garnering so much negative publicity for other reasons. And same thing with Ali. That was part of the interesting aspect of Ali is, a lot of people loathed him for not going into the military, but at the same time, the guy was like really cool and fun and funny and playful and a writer's fighter. And, so you've got all these different, dichotomies of personality and intrigue and politics, but at the same time, the negatives as well.
Ali, I was privileged because of Angela to meet him several times. And there's stories like this of him all over the world. But when he came to Toronto, for various reasons, one of which he got most of his suits here. But, in the 70s or 80s, and even earlier, he would go to, there's only one or two boxing gyms left in Toronto. And he would go to the various boxing gyms at that time and stay for hours and talk to people. And 4 or 5 years ago, maybe, Floyd Mayweather Jr. was here to see the Caravana Parade, the largest Caribbean parade and celebration in the world. And he asked around to speak at gyms, but he wanted 75 grand a pop to speak for an hour. And someone had said to him, Ali did this for 3-4 hours for free. He didn't ask for money. And so it just shows you, like, you look at guys like Ali and Dempsey and people like that who went out of their way. And you mentioned Dempsey giving money to the military. I mean, Joe Louis, the same thing, right? And was still taxed on it. So just, not treated that well by the government. With Tex Rickard, he had a very good relationship with Rickard. It seemed at one point, didn't he trust Rickard more than he trusted Kearns?
Well, I mean, Rickard made him a lot of money. I mean, all of Dempsey's biggest paydays were with Rickard, and Rickard had a sterling reputation as a promoter. I mean, nowadays a lot of promoters are criticized, but the reality is, promoters help make guys a lot of money. And Dex Rickard was a tremendous promoter. He generated a lot of income. Dempsey make tremendous money, astronomical money had just never even been heard of. I mean, just keep in mind, like, we're talking like less than a decade earlier, Jack Johnson was called, greedy for demanding $30,000 a fight, and Dempsey's making hundreds of thousands of dollars a fight. So it's just like the purses went up exponentially.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Tommy Burns was criticized for asking for 30 grand to fight Johnson, but he said he's the most dangerous opponent. So I should get the most for fighting against the most dangerous opponent. And people laughed because they thought before Hugh McIntosh paid it, but they thought no one's going to pay 30 grand. That's ridiculous.
And what happened was part of why the purses kept going up and up and up is because every time they had these mega fights, they would generate a huge amount of money. And it turned out that the fighters weren't really being that greedy. They really generated so much money. The promoters still made great profit.
Right.
And so the fighters would say, "See, I told you so. Like, I got 30,000, but you still made 100,000 or whatever it was, And so the demands would go up and up and up. But then the promoters also realized, hey, I could make a boatload of money even if I'm paying this fighter a lot of money.
Was it a shock to people when? To what extent was it a shock, I should say, when Rickard died in 1929? He wasn't that old. He was only in his 60s, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're going into my third book, man.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know that.
That's so 1919 to 1923 is the second book.
Okay.
And then Rickard died after Dempsey's career was over.
Right.
But yeah, he died. He died before his time. But it's too bad because he was just such a phenomenal promoter. But he had, like I said, he had this reputation of always coming through. He made his promotions usually more often than not made really good money, and he always paid the fighters. He had this sterling reputation, and that's also part of why Dempsey liked working with him. He would make a lot of money, and he knew he was going to get paid.
Right, and Rickard's promotions, as you mentioned every once before, said that he made money for everybody. I mean, the people that owned the concession stand, everyone made money off of Rickard promotion.
Yeah, I mean, these fights were often a big economic boom for a lot of people. So, that's also why different cities would want these fights in their town. New York was a very attractive town because it was the most populous state in the nation. It had a lot of money there, a lot of dense population density, so you could generate a lot of money. But other states started saying, we want in on this act too, and then eventually you see how the Tunney fight got moved to Philadelphia, and then the second Tunney fight was in Chicago, and because cities saw that these fights could be a boom for them.
Right, and Rickard is known for that, but I mean, Rickard promoted a lot of great fights. Joe Gans battling Nelson fight. I mean, James Jeffries, Jack Johnson. So he was doing a lot more than, I mean, a lot for Dempsey, but he promoted a lot of truly great title fights.
Yes, and and of course, the interesting part of why Dempsey didn't fight Wills has to do with, Rickard is one of the reasons, and I mean, there's a lot of reasons, and the books go into it, but Rickard, as the promoter of Johnson versus Jeffries, was very cognizant of multiple factors. He was aware of the fact that there was nationwide race rioting after that fight, a lot of violence, a lot of deaths, a lot of arrests. He was aware of the political crackdown after that fight on the sport of boxing all over the nation, legal limitations, law enforcement limitations, regulation limitations. He was also aware of the fact that boxing wasn't even legal in half of the nation.
Right.
I mean, and they were trying to make it legal, and that made it less so. That fight and its sort of aftermath made boxing's legality more questionable. And then he was also, in 1912, Congress passed and the president signed into law the interstate ban of transportation of fight films, which greatly limited the economics of these fights, because often you could make as much or more with the films than you could on the gate receipts. And so, that was another fallout of the Johnson Jeffries fight. That fight was directly blamed for it all.
Right. Didn't Rickard say after that's the last time? It's not worth the grief. It interferes with making money. Just as you said, I'm just repeating what you said. That violence, upsetting so many people, just isn't worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rickard didn't really care that much about race as much as he cared about the dollars and
Right.
and he saw that yes, I could make money in a short run with a Johnson Jeffries type fight, which he did. I mean, the fight, made a lot of money, but what he realizes is in the long run, you make less money because of all the fallout that happens thereafter. And so for a guy who's trying to make this his business long term and make a lot of money, if you want boxing to be legal, you want less regulation, you want the anti-prize fight film law to be repealed. Um, you can't do fights that are going to cause a lot of political fallout.
Right. That's when you say that, for some strange reason, I think of Lucky Luciano and Al Capone, where after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Luciano not reamed them out, but said, "This is stupid. We're in business to make money. When you do these things, you get FBI, you get local and state authorities on us. No one works, no money coming in." And I guess from a boxing viewpoint, Rickard thought these interracial fights, it hurts the sport, lessens the money we can make. It's just better we don't do it.
I mean, that was one of his considerations, and it's like I said, a lot of his quotes uh, are all in the book. What he said to the newspapers as his regarding his reluctance to make Dempsey versus Wills. He was like, yes, on one hand, the fight will make a lot of money. On the other hand, I'm going to have to deal with a lot of problems. I may not even be able to make this fight because I don't think the politicians will let me make this fight.
Right.
And he continually said that behind the scenes, the politicians were telling him, one way or the other, this fight's going to get thwarted, and again, that's going to be a part of the third book, but it's also gone into in the second book as well, is because they're already talking about as soon as Dempsey wins the title, it's already even at that point clear that the one guy out there that seems to be like the number one contender, the guy who can most give Dempsey a good test, is Harry Wills. I mean, Harry Wills had been avoided for many, many years, including by Jess Willard. The 3 years that Jess Willard wasn't fighting, everyone knew that Harry Wills was like the man to give him a title a fight that would be great. But it was almost universally understood that he would never get a title shot. And Willard overtly drew the color line and said, no, now that I've beaten Johnson, we're going back to the way things used to be, which is all white championship. We're not giving any black fighters any chance to win the championship. So he overtly drew the color line, and everyone sort of accepted it at the time because they didn't like Jack Johnson. And he was almost seen like as an experiment that people decided, no, we don't want it anymore. And so Jess Willard didn't get a lot of criticism for not fighting Harry Wills. But as time went on, people started getting a little more liberal minded and saying, you know what? This guy deserves a title shot. He's a good fighter. He could test Dempsey. It'd be a great fight. We want to see this fight. He deserves it. And Wills also was personally well liked too. They said, this guy's not a Jack Johnson. He's not going to cause the problems that Jack Johnson did. Let's give him a chance. And there was some back and forth debate about whether the fight should be made or could be made, and that's all gone into not only in the second book but the third book as well.
How big was Wills? He was what, 6'4", 220?
Yeah, there's some debates about how tall he was. Some said 6'2", some said 6'3". He was a tall, probably in the neighborhood of like 210-ish, 210 to 215 would be his normal
right
weight.
I still have a hard time believing that he would have beaten. I mean, he lost to Kadan later on, but Dempsey feasted on tall guys. He just destroyed them. I just find it hard to believe that Wills would have lasted against Dempsey.
Well, that's the great speculation for the ages. You can't really know what you don't know. Like until you guys get in that ring, you really don't know what's going to happen. And yeah, I mean, you can make some best guesses based on styles and strengths and weaknesses. But I mean, let's face it. When Wills was stopped by Escudoni, he was a shot fighter. We're talking, many years past his prime. But the debate about how that fight would go, existed, even from 1919 to 1923 and thereafter as well. And I include that in the books about the people that said, "Hey, look, Wills is a real dangerous test for Dempsey. He's got a lot of different, strengths and weaknesses, and this is a really good competitive fight." And some people would say Wills has the tools to beat him, and others people would say Dempsey's going to blow through him just like he blows through all of them, and he's got no chance because all of what Wills' strengths actually match up with Dempsey because Wills is a game fighter. He's going to come forward. He's going to try to fight, and that's what Dempsey loves. You can't outfight Dempsey. You have to outbox him, and Wills doesn't stick and move and run around. He's going to stand there and try to fight him, and that's just not the way you're going to beat him. Other people said, look, this Wills, he's very crafty, he's very clever, he's fast, he's strong, he's tall, he's long. He knows how to move when he wants to move. He knows how to grab and clinch, and he's going to be a tough fight for Dempsey. So, and I put all the different insights into the fight, just like, we have fights like last night, Spence Crawford. You had a whole bunch of people saying, here's why Spence is going to win. A whole bunch of people here saying, here's why Crawford's going to win. You don't know until they get in the ring. And sometimes it plays out to be a great fight and a close fight. Sometimes it turns out to be a blowout for one or the other. You don't know until they get in there. But they didn't, so we'll never know.
Right. I remember talking to you about, I think it was Wills or another fighter, and it said on paper, I think Dempsey wins. And you said, this is several years ago, but Lou, fights aren't fought in paper. They're fought in. And that's a very good point. What's the one thing we should take away, the legacy of Dempsey's career? What's the one thing people should know, his lasting effect? Let me put it that way. What would you say his lasting effect is, not only in sport of boxing, but on America and the world?
Well, I think he helped exponentially increase the popularity of the sport. I mean, and not only in terms of the newspapers and the films, but the participation numbers, and he was just a big boost to the sport, and then especially economically. And the 1920s was just a great decade for the sport in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways it wasn't. Like, it depends on your perspective. I mean, because racism still was at its height. In fact, some people would argue that there was greater racism in the 1920s than there was from 1910 to 1920. So there's a lot of pros and cons to every era, but he created an injection of dollars in the sport that wasn't really seen for a long time thereafter. But even today, we still talk about Dempsey. Still, people like to read about him. People like to read about that era. There's a lot of color to that era. I mean, there's just a lot of interesting stories, and it's just a fascinating era.
It's the one thing that never ceases to amaze me, Adam, that Dempsey endures. Dempsey is the most enduring, I think, of all athletes, along with Ali. But from before Ali, I mean, Dempsey never ceases to capture the imagination of the public all over the world. For whatever reason, people want to know more about Dempsey all the time. They can never get enough. And, partly, as you said, it's because of his career and the way he fought, but he was so magnetic. And just to hear Chris Dundee and other people talking about him, they'd be moved to tears. And one thing Angela said to me was, he never complained. He didn't complain during the Depression. He didn't complain when he lost to Tunney. He just didn't complain. He accepted life as it was, and he got on with it. And
I mean, I think part of it is because the guy started off dirt poor, and I think he made more money, beyond his wildest dreams. I mean, here's a guy who used to make $2 a day. For him to make $20 a week was like really good money. So here's a guy who just made, just astronomical money. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, he wasn't happy when he lost a fight. But I mean, when you come away with hundreds of thousands of dollars, you're not gonna whine too much when, at the beginning of your life, you were just basically a ditch digger and working very humbly and trying to eke out a living as best you can. I think his career was more successful than even he could have dreamed.
Did he really have such a high voice when he was younger that he would go into the hobo villages and challenge people to a fight? Because when you hear him later in life, he's got a deep voice, a gravelly voice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that Dempsey's voice was that high. You know, it wasn't super deep either, but I mean, I don't know that it was, squeaky or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess it was more he was a young guy and thin, and they didn't think much of him until he actually could fight.
I mean, not every fighter has, like a deep voice. Like if you
Right.
ever heard Ernie Shivers talk, like, you
Yeah.
know, if you
Or
just heard him,
Tyson.
you wouldn't think that the guy hits like a Mack truck.
Right.
So like, yeah, I guess if you hear Dempsey, it's not necessarily like an intimidating voice, and but if you watch him fight or you got hit by him, and you knew otherwise.
Right. And your book is available in Amazon, right? On Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Yes, you can get it on the internet, barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com, and just type "In the Ring with" Jack Dempsey and or whatever other fighters I've written about. You can find him, or type in Adam J. Pollock
Or
and
Win by
find the
KO
book.
Publications, which is the best.
Right, you can go to winbykopublications.com and see all of the books that we published. I published books from many different authors, and there's a lot of phenomenal books that are out there on the winbykopublications.com website, and you'll see some great stuff. Even if you're not interested in the books that I've written, there's a whole bunch of books on that website that you can see that you will definitely enjoy.
Well, I got to tell you, it's an incredible photo with you that you have on that you're gonna have to update with 8 of your books. And I'm looking at it, and it takes your breath away because most authors will never, to have that many brilliant books. For a guy to do 1 or 2 brilliant books, or 1, but then that have you sit there posing with all these, your knowledge is unassailable, definitive, and encyclopedic. And I can't wait to read this book, and I can't wait to read the 3rd book. So, as I said earlier, it's always a sad thing to me, like when I finished a Fitzsimmons book, when the book was over, because I felt like I was losing a friend. But it's just a privilege and a pleasure to have you on, and I'd love to see you in more documentaries, and I'd love to see you with your own podcast talking about the sport, because your insights that I see on the internet are fantastic and bang on, and you're always very, very calm in the eye of a storm.
Well,
You
thank
always.
you. You're very kind. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. We've been talking with Adam J. Pollock about his most recent masterpiece, In the Ring of Jack Dempsey, Part 1, The Making of a Champion. He's working on the other one now, and I got it. He's the best boxing author on the planet. He's the #1 boxing historian on the planet. Win by KO Publications is #1 publisher of fantastic boxing books. I saw on his site another one coming up by a wonderful author on the great Henry Armstrong, and that'll be a fantastic read. And I want to get the one one of his authors wrote about John Morrissey, which is a fantastic book. I want to thank Adam J. Pollock for being our guest. And next week, we're going to have Randy Roberts, who's appeared on just about every Ken Burns documentary, about his book about Muhammad Ali and his special relationship with Malcolm X, and where that relationship led for both men, and how it affected both men and America and the world. I want to thank Eric Boyce, our producer, and I want to thank you for watching Ring Talk. I'm Lou Eisen. Hope you had a great time, and we'll see you again next Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.